So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan for Confessions of a Rabbi, an interactive session of moral dilemmas and sexual traumas. Jonathan.
Hello and good evening. Thanks, Mark, and good evening to everybody. Now, my father had very good judgment, but he was wrong in one important respect. He was very worried when I said that I would become a rabbi, because he thought I'd be hidden away from the real life in some kind of ivory tower. In fact, what happens is that being a rabbi, perhaps like being a clergyman of any other faith, it's a roller coaster, dealing with emotional traumas, moral crises, attempts at seduction, Machiavellian families, funerals that go wrong, weddings that are hijacked, multiple murders, had a virgin birth, ghosts, poltergeists, no ivory tower. And I'm going to share some of them with you. And I'm going to make it, as Mark said, as sort of interactive as appropriate. All the situations I'm about to tell you are true, but obviously I have changed the names for the sake of confidentiality. So let's start with the wedding. It would look to be a sort of fairly normal type of wedding. I mean, they'd had a private registry office a sort of a month beforehand just for tax reasons, but this was the religious ceremony. It was a real thing. It was what everybody was coming to. Now, of course, for them, it would be special, but it would largely, to be honest, between you and me, follow the fairly familiar pattern of most ceremonies. There was, though, one slight complication. We discussed at the planning stage, but it was not expected to alter the overall shape of the day. And this was the fact that the bride would not have any immediate family present. Her mother, you see, had died a while ago, and she was not inviting her father, with whom there'd been some, I don't know, fallout in recent years. And she was an only child. But there were aunts, uncles, cousins, friends galore, quite apart from the groom's side of the family, so it would be a much shared, much enjoyed occasion. Now, the wedding was about to begin when a relative rushed up to me and said that the bride's father had suddenly turned up. He'd heard about the date and the venue through a sort of family source, even though everyone was told not to tell him, and he was demanding to be let into the synagogue, literally banging on the door. And I asked the couple, what do you want me to do? Shall I let him in or not? The bride was absolutely livid. The happy smile of a few seconds ago was replaced by a venomous look that was chillingly quick in its arrival. In fact, it was so awful, I thought they'd put off the groom from ever going ahead with the wedding. She was adamant that her father was not invited and should not be allowed to enter the building. What do I do? Lots of pauses. You're not allowed to pause because there's only literally 2 minutes before the wedding, and I don't want to delay the wedding.
Okay, it's time to raise a hand, folks.
One thing you can't do is be silent. I've got to make a decision. I either sort of
Sam and friends are asking some questions. So Sam.
Yes, Abby has an answer.
Abby.
All shores have security. Just get security to escort him away.
Right. Okay, that's a very practical idea. A bit unfeeling, isn't it? I mean, a poor dad wants to come to see his daughter's wedding. Let's hold on to that thought.
Have them sit in the women's section. Women's sections are either upstairs where he can't be seen, or they're behind a barrier where he can't be seen.
Good try, but this is a reform synagogue where men and women sit together. Sorry about that.
Behind a wall.
Okay, let's move on. I think David Langshaw had his hand up. You want to wave?
My understanding was that weddings are public events, have to be public anyway, so you really can't bar people, can you? Or is that just a church thing when the church is actually doing the registration of the wedding for tax purposes?
Well, exactly. They were already registered, so they've done the legal bit. This is a religious ceremony. So, yes, I do have that power if I so wish. But I still need an answer. By the way, it's now 1.5 minutes. So please help me. Turn him away, let him in.
Oh, I'm supposed to do hand raising.
Yeah, that would be. Yes.
Is that Harriet? Harriet, do you want to say something?
My wife does. She's next to me. You can't see us.
Okay, Mrs. Harriet, what do you think Jonathan should do?
It's Gertrude. I just wanted to say that I would go outside and talk to the man and make him understand that he can talk to his daughter afterwards and see whether he can heal the breach.
Okay, thank you.
April?
I've got to go out and confront this really. Okay, it's fine. Let's move on. Somebody else?
Yeah. No, I was just thinking that you talked about the extended family, whether there was uncles, brothers, sisters of the man in question that could be asked to go and speak to him. My inclination is to include, probably for the same reason that David just said, is that my training or my kind of raison d'etre is that you don't exclude people, but to find a way of bridging that with a relative who knows him, perhaps.
Right. Okay. So that's nice and friendly of you and inclusive. So very good. But as I said, the daughter said no way. So we have to balance that. Any other solutions or options?
Ellie, you had an idea?
Ellie.
I missed that.
Window. So he can look through the window. That way he's not in the building, but he's not excluded.
Exclude. Right.
Let him look through the window, I think Ellie was saying.
Yeah.
Look through the window. Oh, isn't that a bit unchristian?
Is it?
There's always room at the inn, always room at the synagogue. So far, most people seem to be excluding the dad. I'm very intrigued. I'm not going to say you're cold-hearted, but it'll certainly. Well, anyway, okay, fair enough.
Conflict avoidant, I think, possibly.
Right, conflict avoidance. Any other suggestions that haven't been raised so far? Because we've now got about 30 seconds. The choir is warming up. I really got to make a decision.
Delegate the problem to somebody else.
Oh, that's such a cop-out. No, you've got to lead. You've got to lead. It's my show. I'm the rabbi. It's my synagogue. I've got to take a stand either way. It's a moral issue. Isn't it a moral issue? Not just a practical issue. Okay, well, I did suggest to the daughter, the bride, that although it had been her intention to ban him, now he was here and others would fairly soon find out, it might be kinder to let him in, because I do, is like somebody said, prefer to be inclusive. I also said, to be honest, it's always far better to be on the side of generosity, because in later years, she'd be much more likely to regret excluding him than rue including him. There's also a question what message it gave to other family members, and not to mention the in-laws. So I tried to persuade her in that very small window I had to let him in. She stood her ground, and she said to me, if he comes in, I walk. It's your synagogue, you sort it out. Now, this wasn't a time for a sort of technical debate over whose synagogue it was, whether it was mine or the chairman's or the caretakers or the board of trustees. The message was clear, and it was now 10 seconds to go. So I had to act either way. And I felt very torn, which is why I guess so few people have offered a solution, because on the one hand, it seemed very cruel to exclude a father from his daughter's wedding, to sort of shame him, if you like, in front of the rest of the family. And of course, if relationships improved in the future, he could never be put back in the wedding photo. And banning him now might guarantee that the rift might remain a permanent one. On the other hand, and this is something that I was rather intrigued that nobody asked, why was there a rift in the first place? Is that relevant? Any thoughts?
Someone's unmuted themselves. They want to speak. So, Richard?
Well, yes. obviously speculation, but there must have been a very deep hurt there. And just supposing that she knew that the father had abused her, or perhaps a younger sibling, or that there was something of that really terrible nature in the background. I don't know. That could be.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and that weighed on me. But of course, the opposite could be true. He could have been falsely accused of something.
Yes.
Or another option. I'm looking round. Yep, somebody eating the pizza, Sam and friends.
Oh yeah, hey. Well, I guess the other option is we're kind of assuming that he's the problem, but it might be, for example, that she stole money from him 5 years ago, or something equally unpleasant, and that's why she doesn't want him there. She doesn't want to be reminded of that.
Yes, thank you. In other words, yes, it may be he who is a problem, but it equally could have been the bride. That maybe this bride, is a nasty piece of work, and the fact that she's togged up in her sort of white armor, she could be the villain of the piece. And here is this poor, innocent, loving, dutiful dad, and here am I siding with a nasty daughter, Cruella de Vil, slapping him in the face.
April?
Yeah, I guess at the risk of repeating myself, yes, of course it matters in the long term what the rift was, but I think you did say earlier that there was extended family of the brides there. So this is clearly a family story. People do know what the history is, and somebody told him. Now, potentially that person could have been stirring it, or potentially that person could have been making perhaps a bungled, but still an attempt to reconcile them. So that there is a big story there, but it's not simply usually between two people. That there is an extended family here, that brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, and yeah, there's something deeper to unpick potentially.
Yes, correct. The only trouble is you're adding to my dilemmas, and and it's now time. I had to make a decision. He was still banging at the door. Guests were waiting. Bride was ready to walk out or walk in, whichever. And I felt, and this was my decision, I felt I had no choice but to exclude him on the grounds that services or other weddings that were registered may be public occasion, open to everyone, but weddings are really a private affair by invitation only. And the bride had the right to determine whom she wanted to be there on her special day. So I went outside because I did what somebody said. I didn't want to delegate. It just felt morally unfair. So I went outside to explain that to him in person. And believe me, it is not easy telling a father that his daughter hates him, nor rushing into such a conversation. But I didn't have time on my side. Perhaps the only thing that helped me a little bit is that I was wearing a gown, and therefore I looked official. You know how it is. If somebody tells you to do something, you say why. If someone with a peaked hat tells you to do it, you tend to sort of be more compliant. So if she'd spoken to him, he'd have argued with me. He just accepted it with a very hurt and puzzled look. And it was desperately sad to see him turn around and walk away. So what happened next? I went back into the synagogue, told the couple they'd gone, alerted the choir to start, and off we went. And I thought the worst was over. It wasn't. What was much harder came 10 minutes later, when I was supposed to deliver my wedding address, telling the couple all the thoughts I'd pre-prepared about the value of family life and the importance of domestic harmony. Oh, that was hard. It was also hard not to wonder, as somebody had alluded, what had gone wrong in their family life. and to speculate whether even she was justified or not, or whether some kind of divine retribution would come about in 2 or 3 decades when this lady had children and they would reject her in the same way that she'd rejected her father. But the worst was still not over. Curiously enough, as sometimes happens, when the couple did have children a couple of years later, guess what? She re-established contact with her father. Perhaps, maybe, she sort of suddenly began to understand what it must have felt like for him. Or maybe she felt it was important for her children to now have a grandfather. But from that day onwards, she never spoke to me because I was the one that had turned away the father at the door. So I got the blame. But there we go. You know, I didn't mind being the fool guy. That's just what you sometimes do in our profession. Okay, so let me move on now to Bob and Eve. Bob and Eve are a decent couple. They've been involved in the community, both religiously and socially. They were popular, often invited to dinner by other people, and they reciprocated generously. It came as a big surprise, therefore, when Eve rang me up to say, could I come round as soon as possible? I did, and she told me that she'd asked Bob to leave after she'd come home one day early to find him in bed with a neighbour. So after listening for a while, I, was trying sympathetic, and I asked, was this the first time he'd been unfaithful? Because obviously, it's important to know whether this is a first time or a sort of serial thing. And she confirmed that, to the best of her knowledge, it was. So I said, as you would imagine me doing, that, shocking as it was for her, people do have lapses, people do make mistakes, and they can regret them. And if that had applied to Bob, would she be willing to take him back? Is this something she wanted to sort of try and work on or not? And it was then that the real truth emerged. No, she said, actually, I'm glad to be rid of him. Because beneath the genial exterior, he'd actually been bullying her throughout their married life. He'd been very considerate in public, but had constantly demeaned her in private. And it all poured out in a rush. It was the first time she'd ever spoken of it. She was unloading decades of resentment. She paused for a while, I thought really just to sort of catch her breath because it'd gone like a torrent, like a waterfall. But in fact, it was to unleash another revelation. And she said, you must keep this confidential. He had also abused her physically and sexually as well. She'd never had the courage to speak out. She'd become, as often happens in these situations, more and more submissive over the years. But having been sort of shocked into action by this sort of sexual betrayal, she was certainly not going to let him take control again. So what happened was Eve applied for a divorce. They sold the house. She moved away to be nearer to her family elsewhere. But Bob stayed locally, in fact, and he remained part of the community. Now, Bob knew that I was aware of the affair and the adultery, and we talked about it, but he didn't know I'd been told about the abuse. You can probably guess what's about to come next. A couple of years later, he began dating another member of the community, and that's when my dilemma began. This woman was a strong-minded woman, had been divorced for a while, and I knew she was looking for a permanent partner. And from what I could tell about them on the surface, it seemed a good match. But should I tell her about his past behavior? Over to you. Keep confidence or spill the beans?
We'll answer.
Based at least on UK actual laws, you should tell her, but you don't have to tell her unless she asks. Personally, I would say you are obligated to tell her because for her own good, you should. But legally in the UK, if a woman asks the police if their partner has a history of abuse or abusive behaviors, the police legally have to disclose it. And so if she asked, you should have told her. And if she didn't ask, you probably should have told her anyway.
Right, so it's a yes, I should tell her both cases. Okay. I remember this was told to me in confidence, though. That's the other thing.
Rosemary is unmuted herself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So should you not go to him first and say, this is I'm aware of this? And also, have you not got a safeguarding officer in your hierarchy that you would go to about it?
No, this was about 10 years ago. So in those days, safeguarding officers, that's a word that didn't exist. And also, yes, I could go to him. But again, that would be breaking the confidence. But also, if he said, nah, of course not. Yeah, and my ex-wife just was being malicious. She was upset because she found me in bed. Of course, I shouldn't have done it. But no way would I physically or sexually abuse her. So you're right, I could take that option, but it's a possible cul-de-sac, unless you've got another route for me to go down.
Of course, you don't know that it's actually true.
Exactly. Thank you. Lorraine?
You need to unmute yourself, Lorraine. You're still muted. There we go.
Yeah, okay. I was going to say, firstly, if you approach the guy and you let him know that you know the history, that may make your relationship difficult, but also he could then move away from the church and you have no option to keep an eye on other partners. And then I think I would go back to the previous partner and say, this has happened, he's got a new partner. Would you be happy for me to have a discussion with her so that you've asked the other partner? I'm sure she would think, if she's had time to recover a couple of years later, that maybe she would prefer to warn someone than let them go through what she went through.
Yes, that's a very good option. And the only problem with that is that I'd lost total contact with her.
Okay.
So thank you, but unfortunately that option was blocked.
Well, at least then she wouldn't find out. If she'd suddenly come back to the church or somewhere along the lines, found out you'd said something and you'd broken her confidence. If you completely lost track, then yeah.
I think Kathy's and Richard.
I was just going to say, you don't really know what, she may have an agenda by telling you that, and it may or may not be true.
Yep.
So I think.
Yeah. John, I think, hasn't spoken. John Ledger.
I wondered whether you could meet with this new lady and during the course of conversation, ask her if this man is treating her properly. Obviously, you've got to choose the words very carefully and it's got to come within a conversation, and just see whether she opens up to that, because then that plants a thought in her mind why you've asked that question.
Okay, possible. She would probably say, why are you asking me this? But it's certainly an option to pursue. David Langshaw?
Do you think you would be asked to be involved in any form of marriage preparation for the couple? Or is it too early to tell? Because could you not allude to this quite definitively in any conversation you had with both of them, not only about him, but also about any actions that she might have committed in the past, any activities that she might have had, which might have perhaps led to her previous marriage failing. They're both, like the rest of us, failed human beings, and they've both got edges to be rubbed down and bits that don't fit, and a need for sort of understanding that each other is fallible and may be behaving in difficult ways in the future.
Yes, that's certainly a good point. And I think I probably would have, or at that point, I thought I would be asked to do the wedding. But frankly, even if I wasn't going to do the wedding, the moral duty, you could argue, to warn would still be there. Or not. Because knowledge, once you have knowledge, then you're participant, aren't you, in a certain way? Anyone who wants to add something different?
Yeah, yes. One of the things that it reminds me is if people make disclosures and say this is completely in confidence, sometimes it might be necessary to say that there may be circumstances in which I have to pass this information on. and not allow yourself to be completely bound by that. But that was 10 years. That was years ago, perhaps.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point, and certainly I think one I would adopt now. As you rightly said, it was 10 years ago. We weren't quite so savvy, and also I was taken by surprise because, as I say, it was on the surface that's been such a lovely couple, and now the adultery and now the abuse, and so it didn't feel right to say, "Oh, by the way, this big secret you just told me, I might have to tell others later." I could have put it more sensitively, of course, but yeah, I take your point. It's a very good one for future reference.
A couple more answers are up. I can see Sam and Co and Sue. Sam first, maybe.
Do either of you two want to go?
I do.
Abby has more to say.
The biggest mitzvah in Judaism is to preserve life, and while it might not literally be a life or death situation, you can break almost any rule to preserve life, and I believe that this is a situation where that is applicable.
Okay, fair enough.
Sue, would you like to unmute yourself? Sue Newling? You're still on mute, Sue. That's it.
That's it. Sorry, you said that she's a strong woman. I think I would look to see if there was, just keep an eye to see if there's any change in her demeanor, that she went from maybe more withdrawn or something like that before I intervened. I think.
Yeah, that's a sensitive point. The only thing is that if he is an abuser, then he probably would wait till they're married.
Yeah.
And he was more sure of his, but yeah, that's certainly a good point. Does her looks or demeanor or confidence diminish? Right, we'll just take one more, then I'll move on. I think Harit.
I would be reluctant to disclose something like that, because the man may have changed, and there's always a new dynamic between new people. And I also take this point that this woman is a strong woman, so there may be a completely different dynamic. And if this woman is warned or you speak to the man, there may be an end to this opportunity to lead a new and better life.
Okay. Right, well, I think we've teased out a lot of the issues. So what happened was, and just to pick up what you just said lastly, it might well be, it occurred to me, that the nature of the new relationship was such that he wouldn't dream of treating her the way he treated his first wife, because that's the way things go. So would it be wrong of me, and this was my big fear, to prejudice what actually might be a good marriage, second marriage for both of them? Because, you know, we all know that sometimes the second marriage can be the better marriage. Or was it irresponsible of me to withhold information about what is frankly a serious character defect that she might discover only once it was too late? Yes, as somebody said, people can change, but my experience, I don't know about you guys, is that actually, by and large, people don't. And a man who abused one woman is probably likely to go on to abuse another woman. So I decided, rightly or wrongly, and I'm not saying I'm right in all of these, by the way, I decided that greater harm would come from silence. Now, it's not easy telling someone that the person with whom they're besotted and they're pinning their great hopes on the future is not all he seems. Because it can lead them to collapsing either in floods of tears, or distraught at the truth they'd never suspected, or angrily denying the information and calling me a liar and haranguing the messenger for daring to spread such hurtful information. Now, what happened was that she took it very calmly. And she said, I know he's had a past. However, I felt that there was a certain denial in that reaction, as if, well, yes, Bob may have done wrong, but it was provoked by his evil first wife, and therefore the second woman would forgive him. Anyway, I'd given her the facts, and she had the right to now interpret them as she wished. I felt I had the duty to give her the information. Some months later, the relationship ended. I didn't hear it from her directly, and she never spoke about the breakup, even though we continued to see each other regularly for several years. Now, with other people, I would have probably found a way of gently asking, what went wrong, etc. But with her, I actually decided not to, because I reckoned I'd invaded her privacy enough already, and that if she ever wanted to talk to me about it, she knew she could. As it happens, he then left the area, not because of this, but for other reasons, and as far as I know, is still single. I'm going to give you almost the reverse situation in a moment, but I'd like to tell you first about a secret that stayed secret. And again, I'm not claiming it was the right thing to do. This is about Jenna and Steve. They'd been to a service and afterwards said very nonchalantly, do you have 5 minutes, Rabbi, for a brief chat? And their casual attitude hardened the moment we sat down. And I asked, how can I help? And Steve looked at me and said, well, I'd like you to help me stay out of prison. It turned out that Jenna, his wife, had an elderly aunt. They used to visit her from time to time. And when the aunt felt unable to look after her own affairs, she asked them to take over and act as sort of power of attorney. And everything went fine at first. And then Steve's business began to run into difficulties and suffer losses. And you can probably guess, I can see a couple of nodding heads, what's coming up. Without telling anyone, he siphoned off some of the aunt's money to help with the cash flow. It was only £5,000. But initially, that 5,000 became more and more and ended up as 72,000. He said he knew it was wrong, but the aunt was in a home by then. All her bills were being paid because she had actually quite a lot of money, and her day-to-day life was not affected by the borrowings. I, at that point, corrected his terminology and said, it's not borrowings, it's theft. He replied, well, it was always my intention, and it still is, to repay the money. Now, Jenna, the wife, had just found out about this literally a couple of days ago, but had agreed to let the situation continue so long as her aunt's care expenses could be maintained, and that he came to see me with her and confessed. Now, I'm not sure why she did that, whether she felt she wanted him to have a sense of remorse or she needed a witness to the facts in case the sort of things ended badly. But what was clear was that she felt very conflicted because she was, on the one hand, horrified at what had happened to her aunt and the deception that was involved. I'm sure you would be. But she was also aware that his business, the husband's business, was their actually sole means of support, and they needed it to survive. And so she didn't want to shop him or didn't want him to go to prison. They both wanted to talk about the options that lay ahead. What are those options? They were looking at me. I was, like you, silent for a minute, things going through my head, but you can only be silent for so long, so I need a reply. What's my options? I think Sam and Friends has got one answer.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, how was the business doing at the time? Like, had it become re-established, was profitable again, or was it still in the red?
Well, just point out that that's a very practical question, whereas I'm actually posing a moral question as well. But I'll accept your point because that is actually quite pertinent. And at that point, the business was ticking over, not making a loss anymore, but not making a profit. Does that affect what you're about to say next or not?
I guess my point was going to be, if they were financially stable, then they could start arranging to be paying it back in in manageable amounts. I was going to say, although I think Abby,
that's a fair point.
I have a question about is the aunt's mental state to the point where if she was told what was happening with her money, she would understand it?
Probably not at this stage.
And do they know what her will says?
I do not know that. because what you're thinking of is what? Is like, so what? How would that affect things?
If they know that she intended to leave all the money to them, then while it's still wrong, it's less reprehensible than if they didn't have that information. And if she was at a point where she could understand what they were saying, then they could confess to her.
So you're essentially saying they were actually only stealing from themselves.
No. What I'm saying is if she's at a point where she can understand what he's done, then they should tell her.
Right.
And if she intended to leave the money to them anyway, then she might have been more forgiving.
Right. Okay. That's a good point. And just please do follow that in terms of lateral thinking.
David Jenkins and Heather have both been waiting for a bit.
I noticed that Rosemary had her hand up.
Yeah. Well. Okay.
So I go? Shall I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, following up from the person who's just spoken, I don't agree. Having had a parent in a nursing home, you have to declare what your finances are, because it depends when councils will step in and pay for things. So actually declaring, you have to be so transparent on a person's finances when they're going into elderly care, and you are not allowed to transfer money out to other family members. That is against the rules, big time. So that whatever's just been suggested, I'm not sure, especially if this goes on for some considerable time, the council would have had to intervene and pay, and that would have been a lot earlier than should have been if the money was still in the right place.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other options I've got up my sleeve?
I can see David and Richard both waving.
David?
Shall I go? Yeah, right. Thanks, Richard. Try and regularise the position as best you can in as soon as possible time. Get the a statutory declaration made that the money has been taken. Get it entered into the books of the company. If you want to call it a loan at that point, feel free to do so. You might not be able to persuade the fraud squad or the family courts if push comes to shove later on. But the best thing to do is to have it documented as a known event, which is recorded, and then hopefully it won't get to a legal tussle. The money then can be started to be repaid as if it was a repayment from the company. It's some form of, the wrong has been committed here. I don't think you're in a position to sort of trot off to the fraud squad and shop them to the police.
Right. Are you an accountant, by the way?
Certainly not.
No, good. Okay. I was going to hire you, but never mind. Right. Okay, Richard.
Well, I was just going to say, I think they have to recognise that wrong has been done and it has to be put right. And that the challenge to them is what practical steps are going to be taken in order to repay. And, they'll have to do some work on that.
Okay, right. John Ledger, I think, wants to come in.
Following up from what Richard just said, perhaps they should consider moving to a smaller house and using the funds which are released to repay the money which has been taken.
Right, I'm very intrigued that so far we've had some really, really good practical suggestions, but no moral fulminations, no sackcloth and ashes. But that's fair enough. There we go. Anyone who wants to add something that hasn't been said already? Okay. Now, you may not like what then happened, but I'm still not entirely sure if it was the right decision. And it was quite some time ago when I was perhaps less experienced. But and I didn't have the benefit of you whispering in my ear, so I might have adopted some of the options you cleverly suggested. Anyway, we discussed the options. One was, of course, that he went to the police, admitted the crimes, and would possibly go to prison. Steve actually said he knew he deserved it, but he also knew the business would probably crash without him. Jenna, and by the way, nobody asked if they had children. That's rather important, isn't it? But anyway, they do have children. Jenna and the children would be left homeless, and the aunt wouldn't actually benefit. from him going to prison. And his plan was, as I think a couple of you hinted, that now the business was sort of stable, he could repay it in installments over the next 2 years. And if there was an outstanding amount, then he would, as somebody suggested, downsize and so as to release the capital. The only problem, of course, might be, and again, nobody mentioned this, was what happened if she died before the money was repaid? In which case the missing funds would come to light when probate took effect. But that was a risk he would have to take. So then Jenna turns to me and says, what do you think of that? And on the one hand, because always there's two hands in these situations, it meant that he would sort of get away with it, so to speak. And providing the plan worked, he would escape any punishment for what was a major breach of trust and a large theft, a criminal act. On the other hand, if the plan did succeed and he repaid everything, then it would restore the aunt's estate, keep a roof over the family, a wrong would have been righted and no damage would have been done. Now, of course, again, as nobody pointed out, it was more than likely that if Steve had told the aunt about his financial difficulties when she was compos mentis, she might well have loaned the money to him in the first place. There was another option, that even if Steve and Jenna didn't want to go to the police, I could. I mean, there is an argument that I had a religious or civic duty to report what had clearly been a major misdemeanor. But of course, in this situation, the aunt had no idea that she had been wronged. And given the fact that the loss could be rectified, it just seemed one of these extraordinarily rare situations where the clock could have been turned back. And I reckoned that a practical solution was probably preferable to a morally correct one. And so I agreed to Steve's plan. The downside for me, and again, Mark may have sussed this out already, is that I now became complicit. And by agreeing, I was effectively condoning it. Well, they left, relieved that they found a way out, and I felt tainted. I also wondered what the odds were about him feeling Steve being over-optimistic and that his ability to repay the money and whether the marriage would survive if he didn't. I never got to find out. 7 weeks later, they disappeared, by which I mean all of them. Steve, Jenna, the children, they moved away, their home and their businesses, phones were disconnected. Don't ask me about mobiles, it was in the days before mobiles. What had happened? Had the business been unable to cope? Had Jenna gone off with the children? Or had she decided to stick with Steve and leave the aunt to the care home staff? And what had been their real motive in coming to see me? Had Steve known the likelihood of this happening and had just gone through the motions to sort of contrition to win round Jenna? Or maybe, another thought, maybe Jenna had been sort of partner in crime all along and was seeking some form of atonement. And of course, the obvious question, had I been duped? Now, I wasn't too worried about that because I prefer to trust people and to be taken advantage of every now and then than be permanently suspicious and let that discolor my relations with people. Now, as for the aunt, I had no idea where she was living and so no means of inquiring about her welfare. But I do know that if another couple had come to see me with the identical problem, I would probably give the same response. Right, Richard, not Richard here, but my Richard. He came to my office at a time when we'd agreed to meet, and he sat down in the chair opposite me with a sigh. It's the sort of sigh that you may have heard before, the sigh which indicates he was gearing himself up to unload something that he'd had on his mind for a while and which had finally become too difficult to keep for himself. So I just waited till he was ready to tell his story. And essentially, he'd had an affair with someone at work, kept it going for several months, felt increasingly guilty about cheating his wife, and eventually brought the affair to an end without hurting the other person too much and before it became public knowledge. He said, to be honest, Rabbi, it was nothing deeply emotional. It was just more the excitement of illicit sex. And although we liked each other, we both knew it was never going anywhere. So I nodded and I said, yeah, well, these things happen. And of course, it would have been better if he'd never done it in the first place, but he'd done the right thing in extricating himself. But I was puzzled as to why he'd come to see me. Do you feel you've put it behind you fully? I said, or not? Oh, yeah, he said, no problem about that. It's well and truly over. But I wanted to discuss with you how best to tell my wife. What's the answer? How best to tell his wife. By the way, we've had several people who've said, we had several people who haven't contributed, so this is a game for everybody. So do feel free to play and do join in, particularly if you haven't said something already.
Heather, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, why would he be telling his wife? That would be the first question. Why ruin everything? If you've made a mistake, deal with it.
Okay. He would probably say honesty, which is, I think, a religious value, but let's leave that aside. Okay.
He might be saying it's honesty, but what he's really doing is trying to make himself feel better because he's feeling guilty.
All right, fair point.
It's not gonna do his wife any good. All it's going to do is hurt her.
All right, so you agree with Heather? Fair enough.
But if he does insist on going ahead, then I would hope to be able to encourage them to do some sort of marriage course together. In fact, they probably ought to do one anyway, because if he's strayed once, he's got some sort of mindset which could well allow him to do it again. So you'd want to, in a pastoral way, encourage them to work on their marriage so that he doesn't get tempted.
Okay, thank you. I think somebody else had their hand up. Lorraine.
Similar lines to everyone else, really, but I think I would discuss with him why he feels he needs to tell his wife. What does it benefit of telling his wife? What does he think her reaction is going to be? And perhaps discuss the different reactions that might occur or the different consequences and how he's going to react to that, and will he accept those before he makes that decision.
Right, so 3 strong voices against telling her. Does anyone want to say, of course she...
I didn't say against telling her. I said make sure he's quite clear of all the different options or consequences of telling her. Is he clear in his mind how he's going to react to all of those? And then does he still want to tell her?
Thank you for that qualification.
I saw Rosemary Croft a while ago wanted to ask, and I can see April's got a hand up as well.
Yes, I mean, I was similarly going to ask for what benefits he telling her. And I had a friend in a very similar situation, and he said, well, God has forgiven me, so my wife can forgive me.
Right. Nice to have that certainty, isn't it? April, you said...
Sorry, I'm not. I'm going to add to the same voices that actually this is something that he's got to deal with, and that it could be that this is something he has to bear, and that actually telling his wife is a way of him unloading what he needs to bear onto her. So yeah, I would not be thinking that's necessarily the route he needs to go. I think there's some unpicking that he needs to hold himself.
Right. So, right. Thank you.
Is that Abby in the student room? Yep. Do you want to unmute yourself, Abby?
If you're going to tell your Jewish wife you cheated on her by stopping someone from the office, you do it with a get.
Right. Just to translate that, that's a divorce. If you're going to, yeah. So, right. Okay. But he wants to re-establish a relationship, I think, not divorce. Any other thoughts? We had all females answering so far. I just wonder if the blokes have got any opinion on this.
Whilst we wait for the men, Kathy, you've got her finger up if you want to.
I'm wondering why he's asking you. Is he kind of wanting to have your support and telling her, or is he, why is he asking you?
That's a good question, actually. I mean, it could just be simply because, people do talk to me as a rabbi, and they come to me not just with religious questions, but sort of moral, ethical, a lot of family, sexual, and that sort of thing. Or it could be, as you suggest, there's a sort of an agenda. What do you think his agenda might be, if that is the case? You've got to unmute.
The rabbi told me I should tell you, you'll be kind of compliant in something.
Oh dear, I'm going to be the fool guy again. This is getting very.
He's asking you to tell her.
Oh, right. No way. Well, maybe that's my duty. Maybe I should be the fairy godmother, the intermediary. Maybe
I think you wanted a male voice. I think I'd go for. I'd say, yeah, go talk about it, because in the long run it might be a stronger relationship. In the short term, it's going to be rough.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Well, I have to tell you, this is a fascinating issue, because when I speak to audiences, usually there's a 50-50 split on this, and it's the men who say what he should say is X, Y, and Z, and it's the women who should say, tell him to shut up. So there's a clear gender divide here. Okay, now I'm a bloke, as you may have noticed. So, okay, let's go back to what happened. There he is sitting opposite me and wanting a reaction. And it was, he started off with a sigh, and it was sort of now it was my turn to sigh. And I said, look, you may not expect me to say this, but my strong advice is not to tell her. Because marriage, and you may disagree with this approach, but this was mine. I said, marriage is based on trust. If you tell her, you will not only upset her terribly, but you will actually endanger the relationship. Now, if the situation was different, and nobody raised this, by the way, because this is a really crucial point, if there was a strong likelihood of it coming out, and like hearing it from a friend or in the papers, then I would say, look, you really must tell her, and tell her as soon as possible, because it's far better that she hears it from you first rather than anybody else. But assuming it is all over, and it truly is in the past, then why make her live through it? Now, at this point, he started to protest, and I actually waved him silent. And normally I just listened, but I told him more or less to be quiet. And I continued in a slightly more adamant tone. I said, look, she's the innocent party in all this. So why make her suffer? What do you achieve? All you do, and this is what somebody said, all you do is shift your feelings of guilt off yourself and do an emotional dump on her. The like cliche we always have, ignorance is bliss. Well, it's only a cliche because it's true. I said, save her a lot of pain and give her the marriage a chance of recovering. And if you feel uncomfortable for a while, right, good, that's your punishment. But don't punish her as well. Now, he said he was very surprised at my attitude, and he thought that I should be more moral and he should be more honest with her. And I resisted the temptation at this point to yell at him for being self-obsessed. I said, look, if you ended the affair to save the marriage, then don't now wreck the marriage by admitting to the affair. Be thankful that you've actually still got her trust, and repay it by rebuilding your own trust in yourself as a good husband. You've done the hard bit, I said to him, in ending the affair. Now concentrate on the marriage. Now, curiously enough, even though he protested, I could tell that deep down he was actually quite relieved that he didn't have to tell his wife, but he'd psyched himself up into a sort of self-righteousness and felt it was his duty to tell her. Now, I've got no doubt that 99 times out of 100, honesty is not always the best policy. Sorry, I won't say 99, that often honesty is not the best policy, and that morality is actually much more complex than simply telling the truth and blurting out the facts. Now, the interesting thing is, that was 15 years ago, and they are still married. And if I asked his wife how things were, she would tell me how lucky she is to have such a wonderful husband. Okay, now, Ronnie and Celia. This may get a slightly more diverse reaction. They had a good marriage, but unfortunately, very sadly, it was cut short when he had a brain hemorrhage in his mid-40s, which resulted in him going into a deep coma. Celia visited him in hospital every day, but never received the slightest response from him, which the doctors had warned her to expect, but which she'd refused to accept. And at first, she spoke to him and told him what had been happening that day, chatted about the news. And then after a while, she found this sort of one-way conversation just too depressing, and she just sat there in silence. After a few months, she cut their visits to twice weekly. After a year, she began to dread sitting alone with the man she still loved, but with whom she could no longer communicate, something she found unbearable. Now, she mentioned this to her neighbour whilst chatting to him one day when he asked after Ronnie. And he said, well, look, tell you what, let me come with you next time you go. It just might help having somebody else there. And I think you can all agree that when you go to visit somebody in hospital, assuming they're there, it just helps sometimes. And after mulling it over for a couple of days, she said yes. And once there, they chatted, that's the two of them together. And actually, Celia did find it was much easier having company, both for her sake and just in case Ronnie could sense life going on around her. So when Henry, that's the neighbour, offered to come again, sort of a month later, she readily agreed. And it then became a sort of a weekly thing, and she began to look forward to their visits together. Now, by the way, I should tell you about Henry. He'd actually moved to the area a couple of years earlier after getting divorced. He hardly knew anyone locally, just went to work, came back, that was it. And he was actually glad to have one day a week or one evening a week when he didn't have to spend it alone. And when he happened to mention that actually he lived off baked beans most of the time and that his culinary skills weren't great, Celia suggested that next time we go to visit my husband, come back for a meal afterwards and I'll cook you something nice. You know what's coming up, don't you? Yes, of course you do. So this duly happened. They had a nice meal together. It became much more of a pattern after every visit that he'd come back for dinner. And then one night he didn't leave. And it became a relationship and they became an item. That's when Celia came to see me. She was very clearly a much happier person than before, and that haunted look that she had after her lonely visits of a year to a comatose Ronnie had disappeared. And yet, here she was with another man. She felt very guilty that she was letting Ronnie down and betraying him. What should she do? What should I advise her? Carry on the relationship? Break it off? She's sitting opposite me. Rabbi, what do I do? Rabbi, what can you tell me? Sad, isn't it? But I've got to give an answer. Right, I think Sam, you're going to help me.
I think it's best for her to possibly have both. So I don't know what you do about divorce and marriages and everything, but if we pretend that you didn't have to worry about any of that, I do think it's best for her to have both, because I think the person who's in the coma, I think it's you read that it's best for them to still have voices around to listen to. So I think it's good for him to still have his visits in the hospital. But it looks like it's good for the
Right.
that she's got.
Okay, so have both, you're saying?
Yeah.
Right, okay, that's one view and one option. Any others?
Rosemary Croft?
Yes, I would ask what she thought her husband would want her to do.
Oh, that's an interesting point. But would she know?
I think I could guess. Yeah.
Okay. Right. All right. Okay. She might be divided, of course. She might think, well, anyway, yeah. I take your point. Okay.
Sam and friends, students, and then Lorraine, I think.
Does she have kids?
Oh, good question. And how would that affect things?
If they have children together, the children might be extremely disturbed by a new relationship. And she might care more about her children's happiness than whether or not she's in a relationship.
Good point. And although you could argue the converse, and that the children might be delighted that their mother had actually found happiness.
Actually, but I think most kids would be like, not. I think it takes a certain level of maturity, which most children and teenagers don't necessarily have, to see it that way, rather than having a father who's in a limbo of not alive but not exactly dead either.
Okay, fair point. Can be argued both ways. Thank you.
But do they have children?
As it happens, no.
Okay.
But your point still stands.
I think I would say to her, discuss the coma, because if he's been in a coma for a year, why is it still in the coma? What are the likelihoods of her husband coming out of the coma? If she carries on with the relationship and he came out of the coma, there's a situation there that then she's got to tackle. So she needs to think about that before she decides to continue. So how likely is it that he could come out of the coma? She's then got a dilemma of, she started a new relationship. Would she then want to go back to her husband, or would she then want to leave her husband? I think I would be pointing that out to her first as part of helping her make the decision.
Okay, all good points. Thank you. Right, well, I felt, as I could see on the look of many of your faces, enormously sympathetic towards her, because it had actually been a good marriage. And what's more, she, if you remember, had been a very dutiful wife ever since he'd been in hospital. The doctors, by the way, said he'd got no hope of recovery. So the question is, was it necessary for her to be almost like entombed with him? Or did she have a right to renew her own life? And also, despite her now living together with the neighbor, Henry, they both continued to go to visit Ronnie twice a week. And so from a practical point of view, he wasn't being neglected as a result of the relationship. And she had to answer somebody's question, had no intention of divorcing him, but did want to make her present and future with Henry. It was a sort of limbo state of affairs, which, by the way, what did Henry think of all this? That's another aspect. Well, he was happy to accept. I mean, he could have objected. He could have said, look, I want to know either way, but he was actually very happy to go along and be a visitor with her still. Now, of course, there is a moral point of view here, not just a practical one, which is it is adultery. And I think that's one of the 10 Commandments still, isn't it? And also there's actually a Jewish rule about the paramour, which is the paramour is someone with whom you've committed adultery, and that although Judaism does allow people to remarry, they're not supposed to marry the paramour because they cause the breakup of the marriage. But actually, in this situation, I thought it didn't really quite apply, because the paramour is usually the person who's caused a divorce, whereas she was actually not jettisoning her marriage. As for the adultery, I mean, it was adultery, you have to sort of say it, and I did, have to use that word, especially as we are a religious group here. Well, on the one hand, technically it was wrong, but I reckon that morally it was justified. Now, I wouldn't normally say this, but this was a rather special, unusual occasion. Morally justified because A, she deserved some happiness, and B, Ronnie wasn't suffering as a result. Now, I did point out that there were many people who wouldn't countenance having such behavior, and many wives who would be horrified at the thought of having another relationship with somebody else whilst their spouse was alive. And I told her that although I would admire that position, in her case, I didn't feel I could deny her the practical happiness of being with Henry. Now, so that was my response. And the story seemed set to end well, but as always, there was a strange twist to it. Celia and Henry continued living together and visiting Ronnie very dutifully for the next 3 years, after which he contracted pneumonia and died. After a respectable interval, they didn't rush into it, but after a respectable interval, they got married. 2 years later, they were divorced. Was it just another breakup, which is so common in today's society, by a couple who were thrown together by chance? Or did the death of the absent third party to the relationship somehow weaken it irrevocably? Mark, I can carry on for quite a while because I've actually got about 200 stories.
I think we've got time for one more moral dilemma. I think we've got about a quarter of an hour. How about that?
Yeah. So the other alternative, if we could just do a question and answer about any other subject that people want to ask, but I can give one more story in the next.
Murder story.
Yeah, tell one about murder.
You liking that? Right. Are you sitting comfortably?
Murder story.
Okay,
Ali, it's the murder story.
Okay, story time. Last one. Now, this is about Roberta, who was a widow, and she and her two teenage daughters were members of the community, and I saw them from time to time, actually never in synagogue, but often in the high street, because they weren't what you'd call regulars or even occasionals. One night, I had a tearful phone call from her saying that one of the girls had died in a road accident, having driven her car into a tree. It was a very heart-rending funeral because it was a young life just cut off, just as it was about to sort of, widen its horizons and flex its muscles. There was also a big puzzle as to what had caused the accident, because the weather conditions were good. There was no other car involved. She wasn't in the undue influence of any substances, alcohol or whatever. And after detailed investigation, all the police could say is that it happened, cause unknown. Personally, I think a rabbit ran in front of the road and she just swerved or whatever. The week after the funeral, Roberta came to the synagogue. After the service, I went over to chat to her, and before I could even say hello, she blurted out, "I know why my daughter died. God was punishing me for not coming to synagogue." What do I reply to that? What's going on? Just to warn you, you need to think laterally here. David Jenkins, I believe.
The God she believes in may not be the God you believe in.
Right. I think that happens to be correct. But what do I tell her? You got the wrong God. God is punishing me for not coming to synagogue, so here I am.
But,
what's the theology of that? Lorraine.
Well, I think I'd be asking her why she thinks that. I mean, what has she done something wrong that she feels bad about, that she thinks that's why she's being punished? Or what is her view of God, that she thinks that he sends things down to punish her? And then, I mean, obviously you're a different faith, but when I've had people in the Christian faith say things like that, I have little stories that I use to sort of give ideas that isn't really how God works. So it depends how much I think you'd have to have a two-way conversation of where she's got that idea from. Has she done something wrong that she's feeling punished for? Does she want to talk about it? Yeah.
Right, thank you for that. Anybody else, particularly those who haven't joined in one of the other discussions? Not that this is an easy one by any means, but
Sue Newling.
Am I unmuted? Yep, good. I think when going through the grief process, you are often quite crackers. And I think I might be steering her towards some counselling or some bereavement help rather than actually justifying the question as to whether or not God was punishing her.
Right, thank you.
Josie?
I think that because the cause of death was cause unknown, she just had to find something for the cause of her daughter's death. And that, because she hadn't been to synagogue, that was the one reason that came up.
Okay. Any other thoughts or perceptions? I think Rosemary wants to come in, and then Harry.
Following on from the Josie, I think it is, maybe she felt her only alternative was to say that God was cruel and arbitrary to taking her daughter, and that she couldn't see there was any other reason. So that she didn't blame God, she blamed herself.
Right, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. And people do look at things in strange ways. I wouldn't necessarily say people are crackers, which was a quote we had earlier, but they certainly are confused, upset, puzzled, hurt, wounded, vulnerable. But I think crackers was meant to cover all that. I think Harit?
I would say that it partly depends on your own point of view, whether you thought, I believe in Orthodox Judaism, your God is rather strict and sort of an accountant God. And it could well be that you believe that God is indeed punishing her for not coming to the synagogue.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In which case, I don't know what you say to her.
Right, so that's an interesting perception. It's not just what she believes, but also what I believe. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad I count too. Good. Right, was anybody else? Mark? No, you can spot? No. Okay, well, I replied, and I think this echoes what a couple of people have said, that I had no idea why her daughter had died, but I was certain that that was not one of the explanations, because I didn't believe in a God that would punish one person because of the faults of another. And that to me would be a very unjust God. Nor was the sin of not coming to synagogue so great that it merited a death sentence, way out of proportion. That was a very cruel God, the God I didn't believe in. But whatever I said, it didn't make any difference to her. She was adamant God had punished her for not coming to synagogue. So what happened was, following Sabbath, she came back. I went over to greet her, and we had exactly the same conversation, with me emphasizing that God did not use the lives of innocent teenagers as a divine blackboard to communicate messages. Roberta disagreed. And every single week, the same scenario would reoccur. She religiously attended, and we discussed, or probably better to say argued, over whether God was punishing her for a non-attendance in the past. And it didn't matter how many times I said that I found such thinking to be un-Jewish and distasteful, she resolutely argued the case and stuck to her theological guns. And then, one day, the penny dropped. And I realized what was going on. And somebody had already actually got there ahead of me. She found a reason for the accident. It didn't matter whether it was a good reason or a bad reason, it was a reason. The one thing that she couldn't cope with was the lack of a reason, and the thought that her precious daughter had died by chance. God punishing her may be theologically very dubious, but it answered a deep emotion, a need of why. There was a cause, and whether she liked the cause or not, she could rest from her search into that most impossible of questions, why? And there are many people who prefer an exclamation mark, however bad, to a question mark. But actually, there was something else. There was an even more subtle dimension. Anyone think what it could have been? Always listen to the beginning of a story. How many daughters did she have? 2. Exactly. She had another daughter. She wanted to protect the other daughter. And by coming to synagogue every week, in her mind, she was lessening the chances of a similar fate befalling the other daughter. So in other words, coming to synagogue wasn't just a matter of atoning for the past in her mind, but also protecting the future. And so from then on, I changed tack. From then on, I didn't disagree when she told me that God was punishing her. I just stayed silent. I nodded in acknowledgement. And she would look back, partly pleased that I had let her win, but also missing the opportunity for a fight to prove her case. And she actually carried on for the rest of her life. Although, of course, by then, over time, she became a regular member of the community and a familiar face. And whether her regular attendance had any beneficial effect on her surviving daughter, I don't think it did. It certainly meant that it had a beneficial effect on her because she found a new home for herself. Right. Let me tell you that I actually wrote a book about this. It's called Confessions of a Rabbi. I think Mark's going to show you a little sort of thing about it in a moment, where there's something like 200 other moral dilemmas, stories to keep you awake at night. It normally costs $12.99, but my publishers have said that when I'm talking to religious groups such as yourselves, I can reduce it to $9.99, which I think is about a third off. And that includes postage, by the way, because if we asked in the talk, I could hand them out. So if you want to have a copy, then I'm very happy to send it to you. All you need to do is sort of email me at the address you can see, Rab Romain, R-A-B, and my surname Romain, Rab Romain at AOL.com. Mark has very kindly put down an ideal Christmas present. Well,
I think that was suggested as something I should write down. Sure, it should be Hanukkah present, Jonathan.
Oh, Hanukkah present. Well, either way, or Diwali present, whatever. Present. Maybe someone's got a birthday. Anyway, if you're stuck for what to do and you actually don't want to go to the shops, then just email me and I'll tell you how to purchase it at the reduced price of $9.99. And of course, if you want to buy 10 copies, it'll all be $9.99. If you've got 10 friends, and I hope you have got 10 friends, here's how to get rid of the rest of the year's birthday, Christmas, Diwali, and Hanukkah presents out of the way in one shot. But you might also enjoy reading it yourself, so don't just buy it for other people. So thank you for having me, and thank you for also coming up with those responses, because I must admit there were a number that I hadn't thought of myself. I wish I had at the time. And it just shows, as I said, my father was wrong, and being a rabbi or a vicar or a priest is not an ivory tower at all, but you get really involved in all the messy aspects of life. And one of the things about being a rabbi or a clergy person is no day is ever the same, because all sorts of issues come your way and you never know who's going to phone and what astonishing story is going to come your way.
Thank you so much to Jonathan. I've only ever had one parking ticket, and I got it when I was visiting a rabbi, because his storytelling went on and on and on. There's something particular, I think, Jonathan, about the rabbinic way of dealing with problems and reflecting on them, which is actually very different to the way that we're trained to, certainly within the Christian tradition that I was growing up with. Things are much more cut and dry or idealistic. We don't tend to tell narratives and sort of turn them over in the same way. So thank you so much for entertaining us. That I do hope that people will reach out and buy the book. Good present. So can we just show a sign of applause? You might just want to clap in front of your screen. Jonathan, if you can see, people are applauding and very, very pleased. So thank you so much.